Hi, this is Randy Spivey from CPPS. And recently my team asked me if I would talk a little bit about the history of the term active shooter and how it has morphed over time into active assailant. And when we first put out the guidance in the video Shots Fired back in 2007, it was shortly after the Virginia Tech tragedy, the shooting there. And certainly before 2007, we had seen incidents happen of extreme violence and active shooter. The term going postal was kind of marked as a term early on active shooter incidents. And you started to see other, horrible tragedies like the Columbine High School, in which the law enforcement response tactics and techniques changed after that incident. In 2007, the term active shooter really wasn't that common in the workplace or the average American's vernacular. But because over the years we started to see it happen with more and more frequency, you started to see, particularly after the Virginia Tech shooting, people getting more familiar with the term active shooter, and the guidance that we put out was actually somebody with a gun in a workspace, in a workplace environment, and how do you respond with the get out, hide out, take out, run, hide, fight type of guidance. But what we saw happen over time is that because of the increased frequency and the different types of environments and the different types of weapons that were happening, some of the terminology began to change. Some companies were not comfortable with the term active shooter. It was too scary. And so they came out with terms like hostile intruder, imminent threat, armed assailant, active assailant. You started to see different terminology used for basically how do you train people in a very high risk, high threat environment like an active shooter, but using different terminology over the years. And the other issue that began to change is, the term active shooter sort of implies that we're talking about the threat is somebody in a confined area or an open area shooting people with a gun. And when we saw the threat, you started to see some incidents in where the knife was a threat, where it could be a bomb or a car bomb, even a vehicle driving on a boardwalk or on the streets. And it wasn't just in the United States. In fact, when we work with multinational corporations, a lot of times they're saying, well, the gun threat, that's really more just you in the United States with all your guns, and here in Europe or in the Far East, a gun threat is not necessarily their most common type of concern. It could be more like a terrorist incident, particularly as some of the things we saw in Paris, Nice, France, Brussels. You saw extreme violence happening, but it was more of a terrorist-related incident than, say, a workplace violence incident. But the reality was regardless of the terminology that we gave it, the importance of training people on how to be able to respond in a crisis, it didn't matter as far as whether the threat was a gun or a knife or a vehicle. It's the same principles. And so what you've seen happen over the most recent years, the commonplace, and I think this is what Department of Homeland Security is using right now, is the term active assailant. And that really encompasses more than just an armed gun threat in a workplace. Because where are we seeing these incidents happening? They're happening in schools, they're happening in houses of worship, they're happening in movie theaters, concerts, political rallies. I think it's an accurate statement that it can happen anywhere, at any place, at any time. And so what's really important, active assailant, I think it's an accurate term, but we used to use the term extreme violence to encompass all of the types of incidents that could occur. The key really, though, is whether you call it, active shooter, active assailant, armed threat, hostile intruder. The key is that people are trained to be able to recognize and prevent the incidents from happening. And if they find themselves in harm's way, how do you respond in the crisis? And in fact, what we knew from working in the Department of Defense, and I've shared this on the other blogs that we've done, is because I used to run all the high-risk survival training programs for the military, and we knew about 10% of people in a crisis, like an active assailant incident, without training are going to be able to respond effectively. About 10% of people with training in the crisis are going to mess it up. But it's that 80% in the middle in an active assailant incident in which their training not only impacts them, but impacts those that they're around. And sometimes when you see these incidents, you watch the media reports, you'll hear that, the only way to stop an active assailant or an active shooter is, a bad guy with a gun. The only way to stop him is a good guy with a gun. Well, that's certainly one way to do it, and sometimes it's very effective, but other times first of all, it's not absolutely necessary because immediate responders have in the past been able to respond and stop an active assailant incident without being armed. And it's important to be able to communicate that and give people a realistic understanding of how that works. And to give you an example, we're going to show you a short video clip of a church up in Tennessee. And it was a Sunday morning service, and a guy stands up in the middle of the service, and he pulls out a gun. And then if you watch what happens here, you'll see the pastor, he actually stands up, he walks around the side, and he comes up from behind and tackles the guy and stops the incident. And you see other people jump in and they kind of rally around taking this guy down. That is an immediate responder. Before first responders arrive, it's the immediate responders, based on what they do or don't do many times, determines whether they make it through the incident and how long it goes. So certainly law enforcement is one way to end these things, but immediate responders can and have stopped it, both being armed and sometimes when they're not armed. So as you look at the short clip here, you'll see an example of what I'm talking about that happened here just a year or two ago. Pretty powerful, isn't it? So we use that little video clip in our training to highlight that, whether you call it active assailant, active shooter, regardless, extreme violence, it's the people in the middle of the crisis that have a realistic understanding of what they can do to bring the incident to an end. And so it's important to give people that understanding that, we're not trying to turn people into Rambo, but we're trying to give them a realistic expectation on how they can respond in a crisis. All right, thanks for your time and stay safe.